Part of the problem.
We are going live.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jude. Good morning. It's Wednesday, January 19th, 8:34 a.m. And this is the first half of the session, the morning session for Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're following up on our, we have a couple Act 250, actually 3 Act 250 bills, but 2 oriented to trying to enhance planning and development, particularly with an eye on housing, because I think everyone's keenly aware that housing is a challenge for the state, and including affordable housing. There's a relationship between planning and housing, so obviously. And so we wanted to pause, in a way, the Act 250 bills we have in the room attempt to enhance the progress that we make on housing and other development, particularly along the lines of smart growth. For this committee, those 2 things go hand in hand. We want to see development in developed centers and take pressure off of the green spaces that we're interested in preserving around those centers of development. But before we really get into the nuts and bolts of an Act 250 bill, we're pausing as a committee to try to define the problem we're solving. You know, it's like whenever I've been involved in a project that tries to solve a problem without carefully defining the problem at the outset, you can find yourself on a trip with no map, and we don't want to be on that trip. So today we have folks from the housing community and to help us just assess where we are, what the needs are, what the pressures are, and the role that planning plays in either facilitating or hindering that. So we split it into 2 parts here. The first one was, I'll just read to the committee and anyone watching the question that went out to our guests. And by the way, you're not constrained to answering those questions alone, but I was trying to prime the pump and bring us all into at least a shared discussion. But you all have expertise and experience that we don't. So feel free to elaborate on anything as you think it might be helpful to the committee. But so question number 1 was, how much housing do we need and how soon do we need it, including, and there we're all very aware of, we have unprecedented federal money, ARPA dollars coming to the state. We've heard in the governor's budget address some big numbers in terms of housing development. No one wants to be in the unenviable position of saying, we ran out of time to expend those ARPA dollars, we're having to send them back to the federal government. So we have a near-term pressure in terms of ARPA. Some people are saying normal planning and development processes are too slow. We may lose some of that ARPA money. I don't know that I've heard that. To me, that's just an opinion so far. We haven't had any data. We haven't had the kind of conversation we want to have with you all today to ground truth that. And then the second half of the morning goes on to away from, so part 1 is just, what do we need to get done and when? And so that we all, and when is that clock running? You know, like just to be clear about when dollars are available and when they will stop being available to us. And then part 2, you know, what are the impacts of planning and permitting, including Act 250 regional or municipal planning on development, and particularly housing development, including affordable housing. Good morning, Senator Campion. So that's where we're going to, you know, there's a chance to start to see where the rubber hits the road and look at Act 250 and other planning processes. So that's the goal today, really, problem definition, so that we don't launch into a bill without a shared understanding of what we need to get done and where there's opportunities to do better. Senator McDonald, I'm reading your face. It looks like anything you want to chip in?
I'm cramping up. I'm on the starting block.
Okay. All right.
Let's go.
Time for the pistol. All right. With that, then, let's go to our first guest, Commissioner Hanford from Department of Housing and Community Development. Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you for coming in.
Good morning, and thanks for having me in. I believe first time I've been in your committee, so let me just give you a little background. I found myself as a housing commissioner, maybe not as expected. I didn't expect to be in this position. I moved to Vermont actually to work in the natural resource world. I worked for the George D. Aiken Resource Conservation Council. Moved to Vermont about 20 years ago when that existed. Tried to find some housing in the Randolph, Royalton area. Struggled. I commuted from 2 hours away until I found housing in Vermont that I could rent in that area. And I found it by getting the Vermont Law School list of housing, which wasn't publicly available. You sort of had to be a law school to know that existed, which I wasn't. But that's the only way I was able to find housing. So that was my first introduction to housing in Vermont. Back in my early days, I had some precarious housing situations that I think has influenced my thoughts on housing. But I started after working for the George D. Aiken Resource Conservation Council on watershed issues with the White River Partnership. I managed the first grant that started that, the agritourism grant that at the time Congressman Sanders brought to the state. So that was my background in sort of natural resources work. But I took a job with the state as a federal grants manager for the Community Development Block Grant Program, and quickly became the director of the state community development program. And then, Irene happened. I managed tens of millions of dollars of Irene recovery funds for, buyout of homes in the floodway, other resiliency measures, but, kept being brought back to the need for more affordable housing in Vermont, and worked with partners, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and others that continually worked on affordable housing projects in Vermont. I remember early on a real troubling, project in Woodstock that was held up for 10 years and $2 million of additional cost because of an Act 250 appeal issue by a neighbor that didn't want those people living in town across from the high school. And this sort of permitting challenge presented itself through lots of different projects over the years. I worked in that director position for a number of years, and at the end of Governor Shumlin's term, I was appointed deputy commissioner and sort of took over the Department of Housing and Community Development as that governor was transitioning out and the appointed folks were leaving. And as Governor Scott came in, before there was a commissioner appointed, I continued at the helm as deputy commissioner for a period and stayed on board as a new commissioner was brought on. And then after about a year, was appointed as commissioner of the department and have been there since 2019. Really what I want to do is just set the sort of need for housing and how we got to where we are for the committee, just give some basic information. And I believe I sent a PowerPoint to Jude. I don't know if I can share screen or if that wants to be, you want to pull that up and follow along, however you prefer.
Sure, let's do that. Not everyone has more than one small screen where they're working.
Okay.
Thank
You
you.
can share the screen.
Okay.
You're a co-host.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, looks good. Thank you.
Okay. See if I can get my mouse here and move along. Okay, so it's me, that's who I am. Really what I want to talk about is how we got to the place we're at. So this is a measure of building permits in Vermont on the left. And you can see that we've sort of been up and down, and we're largely down now. Back in the 80s, we were permitting between 3,000 and 5,000 units of housing per year. We really dropped off in the 90s and rose back up a little bit. But the last couple decades have been the number of building permits, this is for residential housing building permits, has really been sort of at the historic lows. And on the chart on the right, you can see that the rate of change in occupied housing supply, this is for permanent housing, this isn't for vacation homes, really in the last decade, 0.2% change increase. So what that measures is the natural loss of housing and the building of new housing. The natural loss of housing is due to conversion for other uses, or houses that are so dilapidated they're removed from the stock. And you can really see that you have to go back to the 80s till we were really producing, close to 2% new housing supply. And throughout this whole period, you've had not dramatic increases in population, but you've had dramatic increases in households, because households are getting smaller. We have more single family, more one head of households. The average size of houses has shrunk, and so we need more housing units for a similar population when the housing size shrinks due to demographics. And so we have not been keeping up with the supply needed for decades now. And so I really wanted to bring that home with those charts, and then look at the age of the structures built in Vermont, or when they were built. If you look at this bar chart, you can see that the majority of our homes that people are living in Vermont, really were built before 1970, with a large percentage built before 1939. And so, you have the double challenge of, an aging housing stock that was built for large households, which is predominantly what our housing stock is. And you have this massive drop off, really from the 80s on. And I know a lot of our sort of concerns in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of land use measures, Act 250 and others, were really concerned about rapid growth, unchecked growth. And, I think and look at some of this data and think a lot of those measures worked. We sort of slowed unchecked development, but we haven't been building the supply of housing that our population needs and demands since that time. What happens with supply, lack of supply is scarcity. And we can see from these charts, both the US and Vermont, the month of supply of homes for sale is dropping rapidly, and it's at historic lows. There has never been a lower supply of housing for sale in Vermont than there is now. And when you look at rental vacancy, the same thing has happened. Our vacancy rates are at unhealthy levels, 1%. They say a healthy vacancy rate in the rental market is around 5%. So people have some choice, but we don't have an oversupply of homes that are sitting vacant. And what we're really experiencing is folks don't have any choice. They're stuck with whatever they can find for housing to rent, whatever shape it's in, whatever condition it is in, and whatever people will charge for rent. And so with this scarcity, we run into costs that are unbearable for folks. Median home prices rising out of the reach of what Vermonters can afford, and people paying too much for their household, their cost of housing, whether that's renter or home ownership. You shouldn't pay more than 30% of your household income on your total housing costs. If that's rent and utilities. If you're a homeowner, that's mortgage, property taxes, and insurance. And we have a situation where more than 50% of Vermonters are paying more than 30% of their total household income just on housing. And 25% of those are paying more than 50% of their total household income on housing costs. That is a recipe for more homelessness. Folks miss one, paycheck because they're out, because they're sick. A furnace goes in their house and they can't get it repaired. It spirals, medical issues. You just can't live sustainably with paying more than 50% of your household income on your housing costs alone, and have room for anything else to go wrong. So that's where we're at. Is the scarcity has created a crisis of affordability, and people, say why. you ask 100 people, you're going to get 100 different reasons why it costs so much. But what we hear is obviously rising costs of labor, lumber, land, all those things that go into building a cost. And you also hear that there's sort of permitting and regulations add cost. It's hard to measure every single one of those, other than what we've heard from various reports. You have the National Home Builders Association that says about 25% of a new home cost is related to government land use regulations or permits on a whole. You have various surveys from Vermont developers that will point to regulations as a whole that have an impact on cost. I'm not here to tell you that that's the only driver. There are many other drivers to the cost of housing. And I think I'm going to stop with my presentation here and just, answer questions. I have a lot of other slides here, but it's really more about the funding to create more housing side. And so I can stop sharing screen here.
Okay. Before you stop, can I ask one quick question on the slide that's just slipping off the top there? Yeah. Do you know what the time access is across that median home price chart?
This is not accurate. It's just representative. The median home price right now is about $369,000 in Vermont. And I would have to go back and look back to when it was, where that looks at 80,000 or so. But it has been dramatic year over year. I think the price, the rise is about 20% increase in median home sales. And you can look at various data, the MLS data, which excludes sort of private sales. But when we look at the property transfer tax data, there's a dramatic rise in median home price sales. And you can pick various data points to point to the general trend that line's trying to represent. But I could give you something in writing that shows a 20-year period or any period you're looking for. But I would say the last 2 years, it's clearly been a more dramatic rise than we have seen really in any point that we can point to.
Great. Well, if it doesn't come out in someone else's testimony, if we could get some data on home pricing, that would be great for like the, 2000 through now or something like that. Senator McDonald.
A number that's often been cast about is that 40% of the houses and dwellings built are for second, third, and fourth homeowners. In Vermont, what is that number? What percentage of the dwellings that are constructed for sale to second, third, and fourth homeowners?
I could tell you that Vermont has the second highest rate of vacation homes, seasonal homes, behind Maine. And it varies greatly by county. Essex County and Grand Isle County have the highest rate of second homes, vacation homes. As a total percentage of the state's housing, I would have to look. I don't know if it's as high as 40%, but it's high compared to the national average. What this data I was showing is about primary home residences. We're having a problem creating primary home residences, and and I would argue, we want to support those in smart growth areas, such as areas that already have infrastructure, our downtowns. And that any barriers to create them there is presenting a problem elsewhere, and that folks don't seem to be having a hard time buying a large lot and building a large home out on a back road, and that Act 250 doesn't prevent that. What I'm worried about is someone that wants to do a 10-unit apartment, market rate or otherwise, or townhomes in a already infrastructured area that is a built environment. And that's where we want these ARPA funds to go. And anything that gets in the way of that prevents our shared goals around climate change, smart growth, and that the issue of people building McMansions up a dirt road on their own 10 acres, it's not something that I'm presenting a solution to solve here. I want the housing for working class Vermonters to have an easier chance to be built in the smart growth locations we want, reducing the impacts of them traveling to work and all those shared concerns we have.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Senator
the
McDonald.
40% of homes being built for second, third, and fourth home buyers is a national statistic. If we have I'd like to know what Vermont's statistic is. The chart that shows the price of dwellings increasing at a rapid rate seems to mimic the chart that shows how Americans and their incomes become more disparate and far apart at the same rate. Many of the people that live in the county that I represent work and build dwellings in the second, third, and fourth home markets. And I ask them why, and they say, because those are the people that have the money to hire us to build houses for them. And if I'm a member of tell me that isn't true, and then I'll stop thinking that way. If I look at the Home Builders Association, and I'm putting out my lobbyists to the legislatures in this country, I'm going to write, number one problem is regulation and the cost of permits. Because if I can get fewer and fewer of those permits, I can continue to build homes for the second, third, and fourth homeowners and not have to pay a permit fee. And that allows me to make a bigger profit. So how do we get homes built for people that can't afford them? At the same time, we're watching homes being built at great numbers for people that can afford several. How do we tackle that through the Act 250 bill? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I do have the raw numbers. I'm not going to do math right here on live, but in Vermont, there's about 188,000 primary residence homes and about 55,000 seasonal recreational homes, and then there's another 80,000 rental. So, I think it's maybe a little less than 40%, but it's a substantial number of homes. But that includes small camps as well as large vacation homes.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Senator Westman.
Yeah, just to follow up that, I would, and I'm not sure that this is available, but I would like to see, given those second homes and given the McMansions that we just heard about, that was suggested to us that they might be on 10 acres. I'd like to see how many are on 27. Because I suspect there's a fair number that are built on 27 acres, so they can stay in current use and have a big house.
Right. So really, we're looking at it. So thank you, everyone. What's getting clarified for me is the really two different challenges. Act 250 as it pertains to its impact or lack of impact on second homes, as opposed to Act 250 as it pertains to the development of housing, particularly affordable housing, primary residences. And I think so it's good to be clearer. And I think I wouldn't want to rule anything in or out yet. But what's drawn us together this morning is that focus on the primary residence challenge and how Act 250 plays into that. But I certainly hear what Senator McDonald's saying. It's like, meanwhile, our jurisdiction and our interest as a committee is statewide in all lands. So we need to be able to look at both things going on. Senator McCormick.
Thanks. besides permitting, is anyone looking at the inflexibility of financing? And I want to just give a little background here. This is actually a question, but I'm going to talk for a minute. Way back in the 70s, I did business with a bank. It was called the White River National Bank. It had two branches, Chelsea and Bethel, and it was owned by its president. And they were very creative in what they financed. For example, I'm 24 years old, hair over my shoulders, making my living with my guitar, and I got a mortgage loan on a camp because that was all I could afford. And the idea was, we'll live in the camp, we'll make that work. Eventually we'll sell it. That'll be our down payment. We'll get a house. As it turns out, we didn't sell it for a down payment. I'm still in it, but I improved it, and I improved it with sweat equity. As a musician, I made good money when I worked. I had long times when I wasn't working, but I was rich in time. And I took out home improvement loans, and gradually the equity in the house increased. And now it's actually a fairly nice property. That's impossible today. That cannot be done. There's no bank that finances that kind of an operation. Similarly, I had friends who, and it wasn't that prices were so terribly high, but I hung with a crowd that the so-called hippies, no one made any money. So how do you do it on the cheap? Well, one thing was that a bunch of people would buy a house together. And as they built up equity, the crowd would buy someone out. Someone will go off on his own and finally get their own home. They're all upper middle class or middle class people now. They're doing fine. It worked. You can't do that now. And I'm wondering about just creative. I don't think there's a lot of respect for sweat equity. And I don't think there's a lot of respect for creative ways of structuring a strategy. So are we doing anything? I mean, I understand we're talking here about permitting, but I'm wondering if we don't have other problems as well, such as just the inflexibility of financing. And I guess my question is, what can we do about that as well?
Yeah, Senator McCormick, you're pointing out an issue we've talked about and actually have some proposals in this area. What I see is a great challenge is some of our affordable homes, the ones that you can buy for $100,000, $140,000 still in parts of the state, in downtown Randolph, in, Springfield, in Windsor, Bellows Falls, St. Johnsbury, they're in need of a lot of work. And what we hear, and I've heard personal stories of this, is someone sees a home they can afford. They have some time and skill, like you said, and said, we can buy that and we can fix it up. And they go to get the mortgage. And as soon as the home inspection happens, the bank turns them down because they will not lend with work that needs to be done and provide a construction loan on top of the mortgage. And we've been talking about needing a pilot where we can offer that rehab loan at the time of the mortgage, and provide $50,000, $60,000 to the lower moderate income homeowner to make those repairs and have that be a 0% deferred loan until they sell that property down the road. That gets them in and backs up the regular mortgage, because banks just won't do that anymore. The flexibility is not there. The mortgage crisis of 2008 burned too many people, and we need some tools like that. And there's a lot of us, Vermont Housing Finance Agency and my department, and have actually talked about this, in some of our budget asks with the governor's support. You can bring in career technical centers to train skill, to provide that training for our workforce and our trades that could be involved in fixing up some of these homes. So there are possible solutions there. And I wish that the market would be able to solve it on their own, but we need sort of government incentives and small grants to fill that gap, because the banks just won't take the risk anymore to do what you had.
Yeah, I want to add one more problem which is unique properties. It wasn't just hippies who were doing sweat equity. Real Vermonters have been doing sweat equity since Ethan Allen's time, and it's how it's done. A lot of what we admire in old farmhouse architecture is owner built stuff.
Yep.
And what you had was again, going back just as an example, the White River National Bank, they had been financing farmers for generations prior to my time. And farmers sometimes get one paycheck or two paychecks a year. And there's a lot of credit. Historically, Vermonters have done a lot of credit. And credit was given. I got so I could borrow several $1,000s simply on my signature to get myself through a dead period, because they knew I'd get the gigs again and I'd pay them back. Nothing like that happens now. You know, I guess there are rich people who can get a loan on their signature, but a working class person does not get a loan on his signature. And that's in part because the White River National Bank got bought by a bigger bank, which was bought by a bigger bank, which ultimately did all their business with Chase Manhattan. They did not hold the mortgages. They sold blocks of mortgages, i.e. Killington condos. And the local guy in Rochester or Bethel was just screwed. So I think if we're doing more flexibility on financing, I'll shut up.
I would just follow that up. When everything got sold on the secondary market and the whole world changed.
Yep.
So it's good news to hear that you're working on creative financing that allows people to take on houses that need work in order to even qualify for a mortgage. Do you know if this is one of our other hats, the Energy Committee, do those loans require work that helps meet do you have to build to the energy code in that work, or?
The simple answer would be yes. We encourage the sort of increased energy standards and energy efficiency. The product I'm talking about isn't something we have as a tool. We've been seeking it and wanting it. We do have a product out there that the Vermont Housing Finance Agency and Champlain Housing Trust operate, which is a manufactured home replacement loan, which helps people swap out their, very inefficient mobile home that's in poor condition, swap it out for a net zero Energy Star new one by providing a average $30,000 second loan, which acts as the down payment, and it simply sits as a 0% no interest deferred loan until sale, so that they can put the down payment on one of these new energy efficient products to swap out something that's in awful shape and is a energy hog. And it really helps folks out in the rural parts of the state that's their housing stock. That's what they can afford as a manufactured or a mobile home. But the ones that they have are not safe. They're contributing to a lot of emissions, and get them into a new one. And the governor has proposed increasing that tax credit by 4 times what it is right now, to really address both the climate goals and the housing safety needs of our rural working class Vermonters. And so that's something that speaks to what you're talking about. If we're going to do this, let's make sure the new house is highly efficient, and that is always where we go.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction and information. Any committee questions for the commissioner before we go on? All right, great.
I'll be here in case they come up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now I'd like to turn to Mr. Leonard from VHFA. And good morning. Maybe you could just introduce yourself to the committee and for folks watching, and then we'll get going.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you all very much for having me. It's an honor to join you today. My name is Seth Leonard. I'm the Managing Director of Community Development for Vermont Housing Finance Agency. I oversee our tax credit allocation programs, lending programs in the multifamily space, and also our asset management and compliance to care for the projects after they're built, and also our research, community relations, and policy areas too. So we're a couple different hats for the agency. I come to housing finance from a past stop in the municipal world, specifically working in the city of Winooski.
Yeah,
on zoning issues. I'm sorry?
Were you Mr. Mayor in Winooski?
I never had a Mr. put in front of it, but There were other various words put in front for a little while. But yeah, so experienced some of the issues you're discussing and you all deal with on a municipal level too, and I've seen the perspective from that. Also worked for USDA Rural Development for the federal government, looking at how we work in housing and community development across the rural landscapes of Vermont, so have a good footing there. And then in a prior life, did some of that lending. I think Senator McCormick was referencing a community development financial institution called Opportunities Credit Union. That's how I got my start in finance and making loans that maybe other people wouldn't be willing to make. So that's a bit about me. I'm going to try to share my screen here. I'm getting a disabled on it, and maybe it's because Jude, maybe Josh was made co-host instead of me.
I don't. Is that?
Jude.
I was going to say I don't see Jude on our.
I'm here.
Oh, sorry about that.
I'm just fiddling around.
All right.
Thanks for making it all work.
Did you get it now?
I'm still showing it's saying host is disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, here we go. Here you go.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So I'd like to try to be super responsive. Let's see if we can do that. You asked about what things look like on median home prices over a scale of time. So just quickly put this up. What you're starting with is in February of 2012, median home prices in Vermont being at $181,000. So February 2012. And then when we run out to October 2021, we're at $323,000 for median price. So I think you just asked that question. I wanted to go ahead and pop that up for you.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. And I just want to point out before we go that just at the end of this year, for the first time in the nation's history, that top line went over $400,000. So that's never happened in our nation's history where the median home price, sale price eclipsed $400,000. That's now been done. That's a feat that we can say was accomplished in 2021, unfortunately. So there's some repetition and crossover here with Josh's slides, and I'm not going to ignore them because I think it just means that they're important points. We think about land use and regulatory issues a lot in housing finance and in managing our affordable resources and award allocation. Well, we're very worried about making investments in historic development patterns in areas that are zoned and planned for growth. So I don't want to start without saying this is something that we are thinking about a lot. I have kind of three things that I think about, and I want to put these reports up because we've done a lot of research that backs up much of what I'm going to say here today, or provides greater depth, and we'll deliver it much clearly, probably if you have time to peel through some of these yourself. But the questions that arose today is, I just want to answer first. We do have clear numerical goals in housing, and the amount of investment available from ARPA is actually giving us a window to get us closer to achieving that. And we do that every 5 years, that exercise through the Vermont Housing Needs Assessment, which Commissioner Hannaford referenced. The second part I wanted to reference on is that for zoning and regulatory issues related to housing, as you transition to that discussion today, at the end of the day, this is a conversation about cost. And you can look at either how zoning and regulatory items contribute to our projects' final cost and their budget, or how the cost risk analysis is done in the pre-development or project detours that occur for would-be developments from ever being initiated as a result of potential barriers to development. Developers spend more money on a project, the more clearly they can see an outcome, right? And they can predict the next steps in their process. So today you'll hear me referring a lot to the development cost study that was conducted in 2019. So you'll see a link to that in your materials. And then I just want to say also that, as we kind of tickled there, development's really fraught with risk, and whether that risk is real or perceived, when you introduce risk or unpredictability to development, whether it's housing or other types of work in the development field, it smothers growth and smothers development. So The more expensive the initial steps to pre-development are, the fewer projects we'll have in our pipeline at any given time. And in the same way, the amount of resources available can constrain or constrict what the housing pipeline or any kind of pipeline looks like. If you know that there are $3 requested for every $1 available in a funding pool, you're going to moderate your expectations about what can be built. And what's been exciting is ARPA has opened up some additional financial capacity to developers to dream big. It's no small task, though. Managing the risk of development across multiple projects is difficult. And if you don't end up landing that project, that's how organizations, companies, individuals go broke. And to talk a little bit about those risks and what types of barriers that developers might be facing, I'll reference the state of residential development in Vermont in 2021, and also the affordable housing barriers and incentives in Vermont towns, a report that we did. So as I go back to, so again, I mentioned you'll see a couple repeats there. Going back to how much housing we actually need. Yes, Senator Bray, sorry.
Just a quick question. So on the, thanks for the link to the housing needs analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And can you give us sort of a thumbnail sketch there? I know, for instance, when we're talking about weatherization, we're talking about trying to, the weatherization program we're working on right now, its goal is to get us from the current 30,000 homes weatherized to 120,000 homes by the year 2030. So we know what the target is there. Can you say something about what our housing targets are, just in a high level?
Sure. Yeah, we said in that 2019 report, commissioned by Department of Housing and Community Development. So it's really Josh's report. VHFA did the work on it, but that's for the commissioner's office. We said that by 2025 we need to produce 5,800 primary residences to meet Vermont's housing needs. And when we say meet Vermont's housing needs, I like to talk about it in kind of three key gaps. The first is meeting the new demand from people moving to the state and natural population growth from inside. The second key is to house those experiencing homelessness, right? House the unhoused. And then the third is to, as Josh referenced in his testimony, replace those units that are being removed from the housing stock due to older stock or poor conditions. Okay. So that 5,800 number, you know, would, I think the question is, if we came up with that kind of pre-pandemic, is it still valid? And I would just say that it is. Like but if anything, those issues have been exacerbated. And you know, the short answer is, you know, pre-pandemic, we weren't, what this slide is telling you is that we weren't meeting our production goals as things stood to achieve that goal.
Right. The commissioner had a slide showing the rate of housing development over the last 20 years, and it went going downhill to the right. And I think it had us averaging something around the neighborhood of 2,000 units a year. So 2,000 units a year seems consistent with 5,800 by 2025. But so I'm having a little disconnect there. It sounds like the normal rate would get us that 5,800, but we're talking about, you know, housing in terms of a crisis, and we're talking about making some large new investments. So can you help me? Can you sort of clarify what's going on there? I think I just have a lack of knowledge or misunderstanding something.
Yeah, well, can you see the chart right now? The slide entitled "Is Growth Keeping Up with Needs"? Is that visible to everybody?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, so it's that same picture. And if you think about this as a total percentage of overall housing units being created, what we're actually adding, when you're at 0.18, we're, I mean, that's as close as we get to stagnation as we would want to get. A healthy market in the United States is 1% or higher. That's what I think a national economist would probably say, is like, we'd like to see that at 1% or higher. And that's where we were in the 80s and 90s. You know, that 0.64, right in the middle of that, you had the last, or, you know, towards the tail end a little bit, the last financial crisis that had a big turn in the market. So that's the way we would say that is just prior to the pandemic, we were not producing homes at a rate that was going to ever be sufficient to fill the need. When I talk about affordable housing resources, I like to say that on an average given year, I believe we have enough to produce about 200 affordable housing units every year. But some of that includes acquisition rehab of currently occupied housing. And there's not a magic number. Projects can be really different. If we get a bunch of or a few very large projects where costs are a little lower, maybe we squeeze quite a few more units than that in a given year. But I feel like 200 is a fairly good number. So if you think about that, just from an affordable housing resource standpoint, that was only going to, over that 5-year period, we were only going to, do a very low percentage of what that 5,800 that's actually necessary.
Right.
And what you hear concerning stories of in communities is affordable housing tends to be the only thing in some cases getting built because of the subsidies involved, and that's concerning.
And that 200 units a year, is that a VHFA number or is that a state number?
Yeah, that's what we look at. As I look at the housing investment report dollars that come in, I mean, that's such a valuable report to map the different funds coming in and out. Again, if I was to go back to pre-pandemic times and be asked, like, what is the total sum of potential units that produces for you? I'll talk about cost in a second, but you can kind of back into the math too about if we think about those resources plugging into a development at current cost today, divide it by that. What are we looking at?
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Certainly, Senator McDonald.
Mr. Chair, did I am the witness? I may have heard wrong. I thought he just said that in some cases, affordable housing is the only housing being built these days. I asked earlier that the nationwide 40% of the housing being built was for second, third, and fourth homeowners. And did the witness just say that the only thing that's being built in Vermont these days is affordable housing?
No, I think what I would say is we hear that narrative from some communities is that they can attract private investment, and that developers that build market rate housing aren't choosing to build in their marketplaces because in most cases on the rental side, they may not think that they can get the rents necessary. There may not be enough population to attract private development, but that doesn't mean that the community doesn't want to see multifamily housing and isn't interested in seeing income diversity. So it's quite frankly, we look at markets differently. We're trying to serve communities and serve Vermonters with our programs and investments. Whereas if it's a purely market-driven initiative or a proposal, they're going to look really closely at those population numbers, what they think they can get for rents to make sure that's sustainable. Does that make sense to clarify? Sorry about that confusion.
That makes, yes, it certainly makes sense. And and you've said that because the population that would live in such housing don't earn enough money and they don't have good credit, and it's hard to find builders that will build housing for them.
Well, one thing we get excited
right?
about is when I think we really champion income diversity and when possible mixed use projects too. So what we get really excited about is when affordable housing developments also inspire other community growth around it, right? That it's part of a larger conversation in that community about what their targeted outcomes are, and that they're looking to add different kinds of housing within their community. I think that's what I get really excited about, right? Is you're seeing a mix of different types of housing coming in. And sometimes if the affordable housing investment is the thing that kicks off that conversation in the community, then that's great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm excited about the prospect of what the witness has just talked about. I'm not excited about what I see happening.
Yeah.
Because what all of us are excited about is not what is taking place. Today, money is being spent by builders to build houses for people that already have houses at prices that working people can't afford to match, and banks will not loan money to. And at the same time that this is going on, the same administration, as part of their package, is offering tax credits and tax cuts to the people who are buying the second, third, and fourth homes, and not supporting the increased wages to people whose wages will not permit them to buy the first homes, or even in many cases rental homes. We just keep digging a deeper hole, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Leonard.
Sure. I think what Josh referenced as well is just as you constrict supply, we're worried about what happens on the cost side of things. So Vermont is one of 10 states that has experienced price escalations exceeding 20% in terms of home prices. So that puts us up there. And I showed you a graph that kind of got more detail on that. So I don't want to spend too much time on that one. And then 3 quick points. I think this is some of what you're talking about that we're asking for on the for sale market. I just want to note that in some cases you can pretty interchangeably put in the words rental housing in some of these statements. So this is sales data, but we're seeing is that housing is getting built and sold on the high end. I think that's what was just mentioned, and that is something that you can track, and that there's a statewide price increase. And that vacation homes and short-term rentals are part of the factor that can't be denied. And in the same way, people are coming to live in Vermont and buy houses. They're also choosing to come and rent in Vermont in some cases too. So that is definitely putting a pressure on a system that hasn't been producing enough homes pre-pandemic. As the pandemic's gone on, we wanted to understand how it was exacerbating or what was happening. If we knew we were kind of slow out of the gate in terms of housing production and not meeting the need, we put together a survey and had strong participation from a development and building community where we kind of asked the question, like, what's going on in the pandemic that's different? Like, what's it exacerbating? What's it making worse? What's your experience been? That resulted in a paper I referenced earlier called The State of Residential Development in Vermont. And I want to shift back to that report. So what is really inspiring here that I think we should have confidence in, or should spring some hope, is that developers are still seeing a functional market worth participating in. And that's mostly due to consumer demand and the need for more housing. And we measure that by the number of permits pulled. So what you're looking at here is a breakdown of permits in Vermont and then Northern New England, and then versus national trends. And you can see that we're doing pretty well when it comes to both single family and multifamily buildings. Single family, we look at units. Multifamilies, we're curious about buildings because the numbers can really skew with a couple big projects. But there's really 2 key numbers when you talk about building confidence in my mind. One is permits. Basically, that's aspirational, right? Like, I think it's a good idea to pull this permit to build this house. I can justify the risk of starting that development. And then there's actually starts, which it means, hey, I got more than just permission to build this house. I put together the resources and got my permitting and regulatory barriers cleared and can actually start building the building. We don't have local starts data with the same level of certainty. But the numbers on the Vermont side of the permit are very encouraging. So there's a desire to build homes. And you can see we've remained pretty consistent through the pandemic. So as we go towards other kind of barriers to what is challenging in this current environment, it's cost. And whether we like to say this or not, cost is the topic, because that's what drives a builder or developer's decisions when it comes to what they're going to do in a market, right? So in another perfectly timed study, our agencies with Department of Housing and Community Development, also Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, the Association of Planners conducted an affordable housing cost study from 2019. And it made it clear that development costs were already on a troubling trajectory. We were increasing at a rate higher than the rest of New England and much of the nation. And that report spent a a lot of time breaking down the various reasons for that. And zoning and permitting is part of it, but I want to also point out that so is labor and market costs, things that we really don't, material costs, excuse me, not market costs. So we can't leave those things on the table too. And when if you go to that study that we have a link to, you'll see one of the highest impact but most difficult to achieve recommendations is looking at land use regulations throughout Vermont. The pandemic's made a bad situation worse, and that's what this chart's really telling you, right? Is that we've seen prices increase very steadily, including a 8% higher year-over-year national price indexing. And our own resources are only going to grow at 1 to 2% a year. So we don't have the dollars coming into the state from a development capital standpoint, from a subsidy level, in a normal funding cycle to keep up with that. ARPA is helping a lot, but that's what developers are facing out there. And that's really difficult and wildly unpredictable. When we ask developers, tell us a little bit about what types of things are causing your delays and how real your delays are. It would be dramatic if I could come in here and say blank % of that increase is due to permitting and zoning, but that's not realistic. Right now, the acute and immediate pressures are labor and materials. And that's what this chart is telling you. That those are the two key ones. Regulatory permitting at the local and state level are down there on that chart. They are part of the conversation. Doesn't mean that permitting is not the issue, but what I think the survey points to is that permitting itself hasn't been terribly exaggerated as an issue during the pandemic. Its impacts already baked into development cost increases, growth rate, and what we saw pre-pandemic. And at the end of the day, I think that's going to be the complicated relationship or with this discussion you all are going to have, is that if you're asking for data points around what the impact of development is, I think developers are going to be hard to nail down on that. We've asked that question in a lot of different ways in terms of how much is permitting increasing cost for a project. And they're more likely to point to a space and say, well, there could be a building there than they are to say, this particular project I built increased by this amount. That's going to be a tough thing to nail down for them. I think that there's going to be a lot of, they won't say my project took on X amount of additional cost or took XX number of additional months because of a regulatory permit. It impacted my overall assurance that there was predictability of the process for me, and it caused me maybe to not take risk where I may have otherwise.
Okay. Can you clarify a little bit, the line just above permitting was soft costs. So what does soft costs entail versus, and how do you distinguish them from planning and permitting?
Sure. So planning and permitting is part of soft costs. Soft costs overall on a typical project that we see run about 9% of the total project costs. And within that, the total for permitting is in a couple percent range. It's a couple percent of the total development cost. Now, the difficulty with that is that that's a very inexact science, and that a developer would tell you that those are my formal permit filing fees, and that the 6 meetings I had to attend and the work I did with an attorney way back in the pre-development stage that I can't charge to the eventual project, that those types of costs don't always come into the pro formas that we see at the end of the day.
Okay.
But 9% is a good number. And I'll say too, in the affordable housing development world, you see it also expressed in the way developer fees are charged. If a nonprofit's taking on risk of development and it's a site that they are worried about having permitting issues in the past, that's a risk for them. And they're taking on a lot of financial burdens, potential staff burden to try to get that project across the finish line. So that's why there's a developer fee earned, for example, there. And you might see it expressed in rents on the private side or the market side of things to try to recapture some of that risk that was assumed.
Right. And how does that risk manifest? Is it that the permit is ultimately denied, or just that conditions are attached that add to cost and of the project?
Yeah, I had a developer in anonymity give me the story of, the quote was, on a recent 40-unit multifamily proposal, the design review process increased our projected construction expenses by over $400,000. which included additional architectural and engineering expenses associated with aesthetic changes. Another developer shared the story that they were able to get eventual action or response to an Act 250 minor permit application through engagement with the local legislator, but that they received a conditional use permit for which the town had no process to follow through with the conditional use reapproval. So it basically expired. They had to go back through the zoning process, and it caused for additional development review expenses to be added to the process, and then new conditions placed on the project that weren't during its first round.
Right, right.
So
Okay,
those are just a couple stories.
thank you. I don't know if your PowerPoint's over or.
I can stop there. I know.
No,
I'm
no,
over
I'm
time.
not trying to tell. It's just I don't see it anymore. That's all.
Senator
I
Bray,
thought-
please don't cut off the mayor. I think he still wants to say a few things.
Well, I guess I would just say, because in case I don't get to, speak a little bit later, is what we did try to do in our community when we looked at zoning is try to create the most predictable environment possible. And it doesn't mean you're saying yes to everything, right? But when you look at what you're delivering to your constituents, from my perspective, it was always about, hey, we're here to try to create zoning that results in the community that you all want to see, the eventual vision that you as a community share for what you want our town to look like, or in this case, the state, right? And then for us, that the discussion was in about how can we make clear, predictable environments exist so that people are comfortable putting investment into the community and putting risk into the community. And I think when I talk to developers, that's a lot about what this conversation is about. If they can see predictability and they can see, a clear path and process, that makes them comfortable, and they'll spend more money and put more effort into building housing, and that's a good thing.
Right. In talking with developers over the years, the sense I've gotten is that what's most worrisome, I suppose, to them in a way, and then so most antagonistic to them moving forward is uncertainty. If they knew sooner what they would have to do in order to gain a permit, then they could pencil it out and decide whether or not, to go or no go on that project. But that it's, if you have to expend money to get to the point where you're going to get to that go or no go decision, that can be stifling in and of itself. And so I don't know. I don't know that we're going to be solving that one here today, but I'm just trying to, from our point of view, supporting good planning. I would say, if someone said to me, "What do you mean by good planning?" I would say it would have just the very features you were talking about. It's predictable, it's transparent, and it lets people know what is likely to succeed and not succeed as early as possible.
Yeah, we conducted a survey that I've got linked in there, and a supporting paper about what the planning landscape looks like in the state. Found that 22 of 69 respondent towns don't have any zoning less than a half acre. Lots anywhere in the community. That's concerning. And then some of the conversations about potential policy levers that I think, Jacob and Chris's great work is supporting these communities, exploring pulling these types of levers, was by right development conversations, taxation of vacant land, streamlined permitting processes and fees, parking flexibility, things like that. But basically modernization of zoning bylaws, right? And supporting those efforts from communities is incredibly important.
Okay. Commissioner.
Senator, I was just going to add one piece that I've heard Seth talk about and I've seen in these results that sometimes happens, which is concerning as well, is, folks just won't build as many units as they could on these parcels because they've backed off those units because of concerns and appeals. And it really goes against our shared goals of, once you're going to do a development of, a number of units, multifamily housing on a property that has the right characteristics and sewer and water, and it's close to work, why would we want to do less units there? that just means more demand for units out that are separate, farther from town, that add to all of our issues with climate change and forest fragmentation. And so it has a perverse impact of satisfying, the abutting neighbors and folks that may appeal permits, of actually building less units where we should, at the expense of, more sort of rural sprawl that demand hasn't gone away. And so we've heard lots of developers say, well, I just back off the number of units and then some of the objections go away. But that has an opposite effect of what we all want to see, I think. And I just wanted to raise that as well.
Right. Well, I witnessed that back and forth on a project that's being it's gotten underway lately in Bristol, but it was a long, hard road to get to the launch phase, and the number of units got pushed down, and then through a lot of work by a lot of people, I think brought back up again. I don't know if it satisfies the goal of using that parcel as fully as possible, but I think it's doing better than where it was going to be at one point. So, okay. Mr. Cochran, good morning.
I'm off
there
mute.
you are.
Just wanted to add one or two thoughts regarding Seth's comments. I don't know if you guys have seen Winooski recently, but the amount of housing that they've produced consistent with their goals is quite incredible. I mean, there's huge demand in Chittenden County, so there certainly is a market there. But you can see how when a community works to align its regulations and creates a predictable environment for permitting, the outcomes are there. I mean, there is a market in that area, of course, but the transformation is pretty incredible. And I don't know if Seth gets all the credit for that, but thank you, Seth. It really, it's solving a big problem. This is housing that is in the right location. This is housing that's not going to be built in a rural area. So we want to support more of that. This kind of jumps the gun on a little bit of some of my comments, but they also took advantage of a provision called priority housing projects, right, where Act 250 recognizes the work that a community's done on its bylaws and changes jurisdiction in those centers. So you're aligning state and local regulations to get the housing development in the locations you want. And then there was an example, and I don't have all the facts, of a project in Winooski. Seth, you may, and a developer was looking at a much, much bigger project, got concerned about Act 250 and lowered the units to, I think, 9. And he was looking at a much, much larger development. So, you're not going to, it's really hard to get you the exact evidence of everybody's development process and their angst, but there is one there that I think I am aware of. But Seth, do you have any more information on that? Does that ring any bells?
I'm going to punt on that one.
Okay. Fair enough.
But I just conceptually, you're right. And that's what developers would tell us. We can't give you measurables on that. I can just tell you there's stuff that we haven't done as a result of it, or just things we won't even consider as a result of those types of barriers. So that's right. And it's just, as you move into your conversation, Senator Bray, about how do we measure it, what's the data behind it, that's something we've been asking for a long time too, and it's hard to get. It's more qualitative than quantitative.
Right. Well, we always start with anecdote in committee, and then we look to try to vet those and see, is that representative of a pattern, and move to that data level. But it's hard to see things that don't happen. And some things don't happen because of concerns, whatever. All right, well, great. And we are committing the morning to this discussion, and I appreciate that people are jumping in and sharing as we go around. I really want it to be that people are giving presentations, but we're also having a real discussion. So and to that, Mr. Leonard, so I honestly, I just want to make sure that your PowerPoint, which disappeared off my screen, I don't know if you ended it, or you were at the end of your presentation, or you were feeling cut off there.
I think there's lots of great people to come behind me with lots more wisdom. I'm great. I think you've heard enough from me.
All right. Well, great. Well, with that then, thank you. Any committee questions before we go on to Ms. Holler? or observations? Okay, great. Good morning, Ms. Holler. This is meeting number 7 for you, I understand. So thanks for joining
Good
us.
morning. Yeah, good morning to the committee. Jen Holler, I'm the Director of Policy and Special Projects for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. I regret that I wasn't able to join you earlier, but I have had the opportunity to hear much of the information that the Commissioner and Seth Leonard have presented. I think in terms of needs and what's happening in the affordable housing market arena and the private market, what some of the challenges are right now, there's maybe not I can add from a data perspective, but I will add a few thoughts just from the VHCB perspective and what we're seeing and how our program is going. So, as you all well know, the Housing and Conservation Board, really in many ways, because this is an Act 250 discussion, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board is the state's funding arm to achieve the goals that the regulatory goals that are laid out at Act 250. Our mission is to conserve farmland, forest land, natural areas, and to create perpetually affordable housing in areas where it makes sense to do that, in areas where it's consistent with the state's historic settlement pattern of compact community centers surrounded by working lands. We also emphasize historic preservation in our work, and those are really the goals of Act 250 as well. So, and I think it's also worth noting that VHCB was originated by the legislature back in a time when the market was very much like it was today. There was tremendous upward pressure on land prices, making land access and affordable housing and home ownership increasingly difficult for Vermonters to achieve. And also when there were a lot of concerns around development pressures, the creation of spaghetti lots, and our Vermont landscape losing some of the characteristics that we really treasure at a time when there was a lot of interest for people outside the state in moving here. So that's the context in which the legislature set up the VHCB. So VHCB is really, on the housing side, we really are the entity that provides the capital funding. We're the primary source. The state provides bricks and mortar funding for the new housing development, and we have been hard at work during that. During the pandemic, the legislature has dedicated significant federal recovery resources through us, first with the coronavirus relief funds, and then more recently with American Rescue Plan Act funding, and we are in the process of allocating those to projects around the state. I'll come back to that in just a little bit, but to emphasize or put an exclamation point on some of the information that you've heard already this morning. And my apologies if I am repeating something that you've already heard, but the statewide housing needs assessment that Seth talked about, and I'm sure Commissioner Hanford referenced, provides very clear data on what the number of homes that are needed in Vermont to meet our needs, and that was pre-pandemic. That's worsened since the pandemic, and the things that are really visible to us here at VHCB are that there are, despite with the funding that's come along, being able to double the rate of affordable housing production and rehouse in coordination with the Agency of Human Services, as many as 1,300 households. Our homelessness rate is as high as it's been since I've been doing this work, and there's still 1,700 households in motels. When the legislature appropriated funding to us, the clear priority was to get as much housing produced and online as quickly as possible to try to create homes for those folks to go, because even if assistance is provided to them in the form of rental assistance that will pay the difference between whatever income they may have and the cost of an apartment, even people who have that voucher or that rental assistance haven't been able to find homes because they're just not available. And that is that's a different kind of situation for Vermont to have. In the past, we've always been really prioritizing trying to track down and chase down enough rental assistance so that people could fill that gap between what they make and the cost of housing. And now the rental assistance is there and the supply is just not keeping up. And at times in the past, we've had to return some of those, the state has returned some of that funding to the federal government. So I just offer those two sort of perspectives. One more thought that I would add is that with the housing revenue bond initiative, the priorities for that were to serve the most vulnerable, but also to use a quarter of it to create housing for the so-called missing middle, for units that were affordable to folks making 80 to 120% of the area median income. And I can report that when those projects were completed, those apartments, those closer to market rate apartments were among the first to be leased up. There was tremendous demand for those. So the need in the market is not just for those who are extremely low income or no income, but as you've been hearing, there's a tremendous need now for the housing crunch is so severe that now people who are considered to be more middle or moderate income are experiencing some of the same challenges. So maybe I think what I might do is pause there and see if you'd like me to talk about some of the kind of permitting planning questions, or just if your morning is still focused on the need issue and how much housing is in the works. So I'll look to you, Mr. Chair, for some guidance on that.
Okay, well, I'd like to double back that. I'm hearing a lot. Is my voice coming through like Darth Vader to you? It's on. I'm getting some weird echo here. Okay.
It was better now.
All right. The question I had is, Mr. Leonard shared a figure, I think, of 5,800 units by 2025. So we'll consult the statewide housing needs assessment, which I don't think we've looked at all in this committee. So thanks for that resource. But does 5,800 sound like the target that what is VHCB working with for targets for like the next, and I'm not sure what your planning horizons are, 1, 3, 5, 10 years, that kind of thing.
Well, we'd absolutely concur with the data that's in the housing needs assessment, and that's in the numbers that Seth has shared with you. And I guess I would go on to note, and maybe somebody already has, that this is not a problem that's unique to Vermont. There's an incredible deficit of housing units across the country. And Vermont has done well on the affordable housing side to create new affordable homes while also not losing affordable homes to conversion to market rate, because we make them permanently affordable through covenants. But I would say that we all share the same targets and work from that state housing needs assessment and concur with those numbers. The funding that we have available now will not get us to 5,000 new housing units, but that's what we all drive towards.
Right. Well, let me share some simple math that I'm sure is wrong, but in some way. So I'd like to understand it better. I think that in terms of current budgeting, we're talking about, an unprecedented level of funding, something like $180 million going towards housing. I don't know if that number is high or low, but at any rate, using 180, if I divide that by the average house price these days, 347,000, that only yields 518 homes. So that's so far away from 5,800. It's making me feel like, okay, so I'm not asking the right math question here, because 5,800 and 518 are so far apart. So that 180 million, is it leveraged in many ways so that we actually end up with a lot more than a total of 180? And I don't, if you want to substitute a different number based on I'm sure you're following the governor's budget proposals, the different pieces that are going to flow towards housing. You know the numbers better than I do. So substitute whatever number you want, but it's a big number. And I'm just trying to see how it plays out, because although it's a big number, I'm trying to understand how much we really need in total to get to 5,800 units?
It is a really significant investment, and I think we could maybe spend a little time talking about what the different buckets and types of housing and what that number comprises. But I think what you're really interested in is the difference between what that amount of money would produce and the amount of homes that we need. And so you hit on it exactly. That funding is just one source of many. It's the most significant source at this point by far, but that's available for housing. So whenever, if you think of a multifamily rental housing development, there are many different sources in it. And typically what VHCB does is we use the state dollars to put the first money into a project and bring in other resources pretty significantly, including the low-income housing tax, federal low-income housing tax credits that VHFA administers, that bring in private equity that can cover as much as 2/3 of that cost. So the strategy, Vermont strategy and VHCB strategy, and we do this in collaboration with the Department of Housing Community Development, VHFA, State Housing Authority, and others, is to take those federal dollars or those state dollars and try to leverage as many other resources as possible.
Sure.
So yes, in normal times, a state dollar to VHCB or, for housing capital might be leveraged by 4 to 6 other dollars in housing, monies that come in from private equity or from other federal housing programs or local community fundraising, Federal Home Loan Bank funds, other sources. Another distinction that might be helpful to make, that while the median house price, I think you said was middle threes right now, middle 300. I don't think that that's necessarily new homes. It may be the resale price for all homes, and that can be different than what the cost is to actually construct a new home.
Right. Okay.
It looks like maybe Commissioner Hanford has something he wants to add to that.
Sorry, I was just going to try to clarify numbers here. Between last year and this year, the governor has asked for $250 million to go into housing, majority of which is ARPA dollars, but also general fund. And with the budget proposals this year, we would reach that $250 million. We did appropriate quite a bit last year, but to echo what Jen said, that's leveraged with lots of other sources, the federal tax credits, others. And then when you talk about home ownership, the largest source being the private, mortgage that folks are taking on. So the math is a little confusing and daunting. But I would agree with Jen that our need of 5,800 new homes, even with this massive investment and all those other leverages, is not enough to get to 5,800 homes with public support alone.
Okay, sure. All right. Well, great. So we are at 10. We tried, we'll pick up the same line of discussion and then pivot to the a little more on, we've already dipped into it some, but turning to the permitting and planning piece and try to understand better whether or not anything in the bill would be judged useful to you all. I mean, I guess, that in the end, we're not interested in just passing a bill. We're trying to consider passing a bill that's useful to the on planning, particularly as it relates to housing. And we will, it's just prior to 10 now, so we'll take a break. We'll, for mental and physical health, we return at 10:30. And I'm sure people have plenty of things to do during the break, whether it's taking a walk or answering 13 emails. So we'll be back at 10:30. And just a reminder, folks, you can stay on the call, but you may want to